Hello and welcome to another video by Rick Miracle Me. In my series Freemasonry and Satanism. There's one topic I've been meaning to make a video about, but then again I have a whole lot of books I want to review. I've got over 1,000 books in my office and we're up to series 264 on this one. So 700 or 800 more books I have to try to make a video on someday. But this topic I've been wanting to talk about because it's quite disturbing to me. Quite controversial also. Canadian bestseller. The American and French armies caused about 1 million German prisoners of war to die starting in April 1945. Other losses. One of the biggest stories of the century, it says there. That would have been the Montreal Gazette. The back of the book. Revised with startling new evidence. Other losses. An investigation into the mass deaths of German prisoners at the hands of the Americans and French after World War II. Stunning time. A brave and dogged book which ferrets out one of the war's least welcome secrets. One which tarnishes the victory. Julian Barnes, The Independent on Sunday. This sober and disturbing book causes howls of protest from Americans, yet the evidence is neither casual nor circumstantial. Richard Overy, The Observer newspaper, I guess. Other losses has confronted us with the outline of a horror story. Our horror story. The Winnipeg Free Press. James Barque, I hope I'm not saying his name wrong, is a writer and a former publisher. He is also the author of Just Raoul, Adventures in the French Resistance, and several novels. He lives in Toronto. So I've been reading this book for a couple days and looking at some other research material. For example, before I read from the book, you can go on the internet and search the Morgenthau Plan implemented by Eisenhower. The Morgenthau Plan. So after the war, approximately 2 million German military men surrendered. And they were taken to big fenced-in areas, no buildings, no facilities, no beds, no stoves. And they were sorted out. A lot of them were handed over to France, who wanted them for labor to rebuild France. So there's a lot more here to the story. But anyways, apparently Morgenthau was a well-known, connected Jewish man. And he had some issues before the war with Germany. And so after the war, apparently the Morgenthau Plan, part of it was to eliminate these German citizens. Even women and children and old men were taken into custody in a lot of cases. But according to the Yahoo search results, the directive was formally issued to Eisenhower in the spring of 1945. and it asserts that the Morgenthau Plan was never implemented. The Eisenhower death camps. TrueDemocracyParty.net. German Holocaust, German genocide. 9 to 15 million Germans killed from 1945 to 1953, after World War II. 9 to 15 million Germans killed, according to this search results. Post-World War II. The Morgenthau Plan, Eisenhower death camps, a forgotten genocide. So a lot of people, they say, are Holocaust deniers. And apparently in Europe and other places, you can actually go to prison for denying that the Germans rounded up 6 million Jews and gassed them to death. Intentional. They call it the Holocaust. And it seems to me, by my research, and I'm an American, and so far we don't have laws preventing anybody to speak about the truth and research and do book reviews. But the day may be coming where they do that. Right now, the religious leaders of Israel, the Sanhedrin of the Jewish people, are calling on the U.S. government to enact legislation and take action against those people who are boycotting Israel and saying anything that might be disagreeable to the Holocaust story. Like I said, in Europe, it's a crime. You can go to prison. And they're trying to press our government here in the USA to pass some laws making it a hate crime to say anything about the Jewish people, Zionist people, Israel, boycotting. And I guess they would like to make it a crime and have people arrested in the United States. And also trying to get our government to enforce some religious laws called Noahide laws that were passed many years ago, probably unconstitutional, superseding Christianity and other religions, saying what religion should dictate, and anybody who believes in a false deity, a false god, and they're naming that Jesus is a false deity, would be guilty of heresy, punishable by beheading. So some strange times might be coming. But anyway, so the Holocaust theory says that they're saying that Germany intentionally rounded up 6 million Jews and gassed them in ovens. And I made a video on going on Yahoo image site, and I put in the Morgenthau Plan and Germany must perish, etc. And apparently all throughout Europe, including Russia, there weren't 6 million Jews. So something's not right with the math. And a lot of other more scientifically educated people who did some testing over there, gas inside those buildings, said that there wasn't any way that 6 million people would have been gassed. There would have been physical evidence. But again, you can't discuss this in Europe, and they're trying to make it a illegal conversation here in America. And of course, apparently President Donald Trump is obviously on the side of Israel, even announcing that the U.S. recognizes Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, and Israel even minting coins coming from the Sanhedrin with Donald Trump's head on it next to King Cyrus, the last leader who helped the Jews rebuild King Solomon's temple the second time. And on top of the coin it says the Balfour Agreement, which was an agreement made by the elite Zionist Jewish folks during World War I, when Germany was winning the war, hands down. but some Jewish elite who couldn't convince Germany to support their plans to take the Palestinian people's land and create the state of Israel. So they just switched sides and made an agreement with the losing party of World War I, Britain, and said, hey, we can get America in the war, and we can get you all the money you want, and we'll get all the Jews all over the world to support you, but we want you to give us the Palestinian people's land. Help us get it. And apparently after World War I, Britain did not fulfill that commitment in writing. I've gone over that document. You can look it up. So apparently they had to have World War II to take control of the Middle East and destroy Turkey and the Ottoman Empire. And for the final blow to bring about the global world order, it looks like they'll have to have World War III. And a lot of people are predicting, and this is kind of scary information, that if they have World War III, it's planned that America will lose the war. And think about it, it's not so far-fetched. America fighting Russia and China, etc. And the major population is in the cities, and people are not farming or producing their goods. Even the government recently announced that Americans should be prepared for the electric grid to go down and be down for up to as long as 6 months, which means when the grid goes down, it'll be down, who knows. And food supplies will stop, gas supplies will stop, water facilities will not work, you need electricity, and sewer systems and medicine and everything else. So what's really concerning to me, in going over this information, in Russia, after the Bolshevik invasion, after World War I, espionage, and they took over that country after World War I, and prior to World War II, it's said that they've killed up to 100 million Russians and Christians and destroyed the Christian churches, and not the Jewish people or the Jewish temples. This is on Jeff Rentz's website. Apparently a major Israeli newspaper admitted 25 million Russian Christians and citizens were killed, and a lot of other report says 66 million. But nevertheless, Russia was destroyed, invaded by the Bolshevik Jewish people, and of course they brought the world communism and spread all over the world, controlling that vast country. So there's more going on here, and a lot of those people, the 100 million, if it's that much or more, they died hugely through starvation. And apparently, same thing was going on in the Ukraine. And so they did this in Germany after World War II. And apparently, they've been doing it in many countries all over the world for the past 100 years, probably longer. Apparently, they're doing it right now in Venezuela. Venezuela has a huge oil reserve, and even huge mineral resources, including gold. But apparently these elites do not control Venezuela. So they have an embargo on Venezuela. No goods coming in or out, bought or sold, stifling their economy, causing their accusations, you can go look it up, of starvation and a lot of suffering and death. And apparently we've all seen in the news in the Middle East, after they invaded Iraq or Afghanistan and many other countries, all commerce stopped, and you had a lot of starvation, men trying to get food for their children and family and wives, and they would call them insurgents or terrorists and killing them. And a lot of times these people were killed, by jets dropping bombs or liquid molten sulfur from the sky. So these people flying these planes or launching these missiles never had to look the people in the face that they were killing. It's quite bizarre. It's a sad day for planet Earth, the things that have been going on and I've been discovering. So after World War II, They didn't want to relocate the German soldiers back to their hometowns. They didn't want those citizens to go home. They decided to eliminate them. Now, there is one particular reason why France might want that. Because after World War I, some of the land between Germany and France, call it a buffer zone, but it was a huge portion of land, was after World War I and Germany lost the war, France took a lot of that land and exiled or banished the Germans, and it was a big piece of land. So during World War II, Germany took that land back, and after World War II, they had to single out a lot of German citizens who might have lived in that area, and they probably didn't want them to go back to that area. And other boundary line disputes with Germany and Poland and other countries. There was a lot of politics behind the scenes, but suffice it to say, if they eliminated 1 million or more, 2 million German citizens, there was a lot to go around for the people who were taking over things. And I feel that that's one of the reasons they had the Civil War in America. You know, we had a lot of people who had a lot of plantations and ranches and farms and businesses. The United States was doing quite well prior to the Civil War. But, you know, at the end of the Civil War, when the South lost, they had a lot of these elite so-called carpetbaggers going down there and taking all these properties of all the citizens that were killed. So I have been putting two and two together, and it seems like the Ukraine or in other countries all over the world, Bangladesh, African countries, they try to depopulate those countries, and seemingly they do it by starvation is a method of choice, saying there's no food, and if people try to get out of the fenced-in area, they just machine gun them, shoot them. And another one, I think, in Africa and other places, is there seems like they're intentionally releasing different kinds of plagues. This isn't me. You can go look it up. Leonard Horowitz's book AIDS, Ebola, shows that they were testing these AIDS designer viruses in California and New York and apparently Africa, and so much more. So again, my huge concern here is when I read from this book and tell this story, if they do have World War III, and it's if I was a betting man, I would say it's quite possible. I mean, Albert Pike predicted 3 world wars in 1880 something, and who would be those wars would be fought between, and he was correct on the first 2. He was into the occult, and apparently they communicate with some beings called masters, so maybe they can be prophets and know what's going on in the future. And if the United States is going to lose World War III, and create a reality like the Hunger Games movie, and maybe they will want to depopulate America like the Georgia USA Guidestones say, 500 million people worldwide, and we're supposed to have over 6 billion now. So will these insane, horrible events happen here in the USA if we have World War III or some other catastrophe where there's no food or water? Will the people go insane and start rioting and killing each other? It seems likely. And I am not a prophet. I'm just reading this stuff and reading these books, and I've seen what's happened in war after war after war, revolution. Again, all brought about by these elite insiders. And we have names. We know the secret societies. We know their motivation. We know that apparently they're into sinister cults, Luciferianism, Satanism, even Baal worship, B-A-A-L, where they were putting the Archway of Baal in New York and London. And then later I learned they were putting up 1,000 archways of all over the world, coming out of UNESCO, the United Nations Education and Science Department. And we know a lot of our leaders have been photographed at the Bohemian Grove in California, where they have a giant owl, and apparently they throw a baby in the fire in a ceremony called the cremation of care. So all these demonic type of beings, with even Shiva and Kali on the Empire State Building, and a statue of Shiva out in front of CERN, and so much more. The satanic cult symbols are everywhere, even on the back of the dollar bill. So you have this Jewish man, Morgenthau, who was saying Germany was the problem prior to World War II. And there was a book published, Germany Must Perish, amongst many, many, many other documents and advertisements and essays in magazines, newspapers, and journals. I was downloading a list of that the other day. It's just, there's too much evidence. So they hated Germany prior to World War II. They hated Russia prior to World War I, because Russia was coming down policing the Jewish people for a couple hundred years. So they had to have revenge in Russia. And they did. Apparently they killed up to 100 million people. And in Ukraine. And in Germany, there was revenge extracted after World War II. So, and the Jews, I've read a lot of the literature, they do blame even America and all we other people, non-Jews, all over the world, for these horrible things that happened to them. So if they extracted revenge on the Russians and the Ukrainians and all those people in the Middle East, Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria and Libya and Tunisia and Egypt, and on and on and on, if we lose the war, will they extract revenge against we USA citizens? Is that a fair question? I mean, if we've seen what has happened too many times to count, even in Vietnam and all these other countries, and Central South America, these elites who control the world, African nations, even the war between the North and the South, the Civil War in the 1800s, and between World War I and World War II. You know, a lot of people vaguely know about the Great Depression in America, but they don't know that all over the world there was a recession, depressions. So whoever were controlling the money supplies, these elites, they were bringing this about. At that period of time in the Ukraine and in Russia, they were killing over 100 million people between World War I and World War II. So after World War II, is there any doubt that they didn't want those 2 million soldiers and a lot of imprisoned women and children and old men? They found it much more convenient to have them just killed. A forgotten genocide. And here it says 9 to 15 million Germans killed from 1945 to 1953. 9 to 15 million. And they're saying there was 6 million Jews gassed in Germany during World War II, when I have documents here that shows there weren't even 6 million Jews in all over Europe. And apparently there were some deals made where Hitler was cooperating, and a lot of Jews were being sent to Israel prior to World War II and during. I have a book on that we'll have to go over. But back to this Yahoo search. The Morgenthau Plan included not so subtle chiefs of staff issued to Eisenhower. Morgenthau Plan, War Wiki, Morgenthau to be able to weld and being implemented. The Morgenthau Plan spawned. Was the Morgenthau Plan implemented at the end of the war? Did the agreement change? So they don't want this information out there, but we all know, like in Russia, in Ukraine, in the Middle East since 9/11, that they are depopulating those citizens, killing them. And some of them they're importing into Europe and America and other countries all over the world, probably Central South America, and apparently disrupting those countries which have a religion that is not Christian, and most of those countries are Christian countries. So they're causing a lot of upheaval there, again, which I think is all intentional. Eisenhower and German POWs, the Protest Project. So you can go look this up and get educated on it. I did make a video with the pictures. But the Morgenthau Plan. And apparently you can see here there's 466,000 results. So again, just to make a short synopsis, about 2 million German soldiers surrendered after World War II. And they surrendered, apparently, enthusiastically. They probably didn't like the war. But when you belong to a country and your country declares war, you institute martial law, and if you don't do what your government tells you when they recruit you to go to battle, you can be executed immediately. You have to obey. And again, I caution people, especially with Donald Trump recently. This is the May 11th, 2019, and 2 days ago they said that the tariffs on Chinese goods were going up from 10% to 25%, and China said that there will be retaliation. This is a big threatening thing when you put a 25% tax burden on a country like China with 1 billion plus people. Those are fighting words, and there's a lot of other things going on with China, disputes over the sea. So, it wouldn't surprise me if China got together with Russia and made an agreement to go to war with America and the Allies. And who knows who will join one side, Maybe a lot of European countries will say, wow, we're going to go with the winning team. We're going to go with China and Russia and Israel, whoever. We don't know how it's going to play out. And then, of course, President Donald Trump, it was in the news a couple days ago, is sending a whole fleet of ships and an aircraft carrier off the coast of Iran and bomber planes. So you've got that threat to Iran, and Russia backs up Iran, and you got the threat over here with China. You can almost see this as like a chess game and how it could play out. And I'm not the only one talking about it. I watch videos every day, and other people are talking about it. And if they do design it for America to lose the war, will they do to Americans and cut off the food supply and water supply and electricity and everything else like they've done in an uncountable number of other nations? It's huge. They've done it every time. So why would the United States be an exception? And they're even saying the United States seemingly is getting in position for a revolution internally because you have the transgender anti-Christian people. You get the hand right here. Transgender anti-Christian people against the family value Christian people who don't want to go with this satanic Lucifer philosophy. So if they can continue to raise that up and blame all of the chaos and anarchy on the Christian people, so who will come out the winner? Who's designed it to come out the winner? Do they want the New Agers and the Satanists destroyed? Or do they want the Christians destroyed? Or do they just want to leave it up to fate and see which one wins, and then let the murder begin depopulating the country once they take over? Is this all just a too far-fetched conversation? And I'm not the only one having it. I watch videos. I got the books. Other losses. So apparently they had to eliminate all those German citizens and troops that they had taken prisoner or taken captive or put somewhere. The cities were bombed. There wasn't any water or food. So it wasn't just soldiers. So as usual, I'll just start somewhere. I've been reading this book for a couple days. So I did read this chapter here, Inside the Greenhouse, by a book, Other Losses. Talks about all those prisoners, almost 2 million of them. And the Morgenthau plan, part of that with Eisenhower, was just to liquidate those humans. And if you know anything about me and what I say, one death is too many deaths for me. I feel the pain for all those people in Iraq and Syria today and Venezuela and countries all over the world. And when I find out, after the war, my country, I'm an American, the leaders in high places made decisions just to liquidate those German soldiers and men, women, and old men, women, and children. And they did it in the Ukraine. They did it in many other countries. It's been in the news. They're doing it to Venezuela. So again, for them not to do it if America lost World War III, that would be unusual. So inside the greenhouse, the French prison system is a glass house where there is nothing to hide. The French prison system is a glass house with nothing to hide, it says in this book. And that would have been Major General Boussion, so one of the leaders in France. And again, like 911, they tell the citizens, we people, a particular story. Some Arabs in a cave came up with the plan to do 911. And later on we learned that even Mossad intelligence agents and other citizens were actually involved. But you can't talk about that. That could be an accusation of anti-Semitism, even if it's true. Now that's an interesting point. If they make these laws that it's a hate crime to talk about Israel, Zionism, globalism, Satanism, Luciferianism, even if it's true, if they pass a law, you can't talk about it. You could go to prison. If they try to enforce the Noahide laws and you continue to believe Jesus and you testify that Jesus is your Savior, you could be accused of heresy and be beheaded. So the truth is not going to save anybody. These evil forces that control our world don't care about the truth. And if you're into Satanism and Luciferianism, people who are into Christianity, there's no reconciling those two groups. The Christians don't want to become evil, and the evil people don't want to practice ethics and morality. It's clear cut, pretty clear. And they say it more and more openly, especially with the symbols. Even during Emmys and Grammys and tunnel openings and Super Bowl halftime shows and movies and cartoons. The mind control and the apparatus for policing us and monitoring us and even being able to zap us with microwaves and other weapons is growing larger every day. And the crazy weather in the middle of the United States seems to be insane right now. Also, if you didn't know this, apparently the weather in Iran has been insane. So there's a lot of accusations from Dane Wigington and Deborah Tavares and many others, Richie from Boston, that says they're controlling the weather. So somebody's pushing the envelope, like a freight train coming at us. They're trying to destroy the whole society, bring it to a crash and burn situation. And they've even warned us, like I said earlier, that the Americans should be prepared for the electric grid to go down because of maybe an EMP attack or a cyber attack or a comet or whatever. All right, so the French prison system is like a glass house where there is nothing to hide. And of course the leaders will tell the people one thing, like 911. The International Committee of the Red Cross inspecting the French camps, reported time after time in 1945 and 1946, after World War II with Germany was over, Germany surrendered. I believe that was 1943, 44. That conditions were unsatisfactory, disturbing, alarming. Very seldom were they satisfactory. So you got 2 million Germans surrendering, and then you got a lot of women and children and old men to deal with. And you decide that it would be convenient if they were all to die. And they've done this in many countries, as I've been saying. Two camps were notorious to the Red Cross: the La Chavarini and the Montreuil-Balais, I can't speak French, where in September 1945 there were thousands of women and children, see what I said, who had been originally imprisoned by the Americans. I highlighted it in yellow. Thousands of women and children had been originally imprisoned by the Americans. And if you're an American, you don't want to believe this. The ICRC, Red Cross, complained to the French that these old men, women, and children were dying of typhus, and that would soon spread to the surrounding French civilians. At the end of October 1946, the International Committee of the Red Cross reported that the situation at present is more than alarming. More than half the German POWs working are insufficiently clad and will not be able to stand up to the rigors of the winter without running the greatest risk of disease. In such conditions, a high number of deaths in the course of the winter must be expected. The same sort of report was repeated in 1947 with the same dire warnings. Any reports of satisfactory conditions usually came from French army officers who had just been asked by the high French levels to respond to charges by some outside agency such as the Red Cross or the U.S. Army. So the French officers were supposed to deny what was really happening. Despite all this, the U.S. Army handed over at least 101,000 more prisoners in early 1946. The British also handed over another 30,000 in January 1946. That the Americans knew that they were delivering these men to disaster is clear in the complaints the Army made through the period about the failure of the French to live up to their previous commitment to improve conditions. So would you call killing the 1 million, 2 million men, women, old men, and children and surrendered prisoners a holocaust? Or would you call it murder? Would you call it the American way? Would you call it a Christian way? And of course the answer is no, no, no. Owing to the continuing inertia of the French authorities to correct deficiencies which have been repeatedly brought to their attention, it is further recommended that the Army try to get the State Department to correct the deficiencies, to meet the standards of the Geneva Convention, and also to repatriate soon all the ones who have just been transferred. General John T. Lewis, who wrote that, must have made those recommendations only to cover his exposed flanks, because there was no chance the French would accept criticism from the Americans for failure to respect the Geneva Convention. So the French leaders did not want any criticism, and they took it personally especially apparently according to this book, their leader. He would be highly offended, even threatened to attack the Americans. There was no chance that they would soon repatriate men. They wouldn't send them back home, whom had frequently said that they were taken back to work, not to be sent home. So apparently after World War II, France had requested 1.2 million German soldiers, prisoners, to be labor in France to rebuild France. And they had requested the governments of the United States and Britain, etc., to turn over all those prisoners to them, which apparently they did. And they wound up in these huge fenced-in areas where they weren't given water or food. And apparently, in one case, in these big fields, they would dig trenches to create some kind of shelter. But when it rained, the sides of the trenches would cave in on top of the men, and they would smother and die because they were weak. They couldn't even move. They hadn't been fed. And in one case, they sent bulldozers in there with the men still in the trenches and just bulldozed over them, according to what I've been reading in this book. After World War II. Lewis was obviously looking to improve the image of the U.S. Army, but he was only repeating recommendations that had already failed. The first faint hint of American future involvement in the Vietnam War appears in these camps. So there was something I learned here that was surprising. Apparently during World War II, France was at war with Vietnam during World War II. So something bigger going on here than we all know. And the prisoners, some of the million-plus prisoners, German prisoners that France had requested for labor, those prisoners weren't fed any food or water. They were made to suffer, but they were offered a choice to join the Foreign Legion, the French Foreign Legion, and go fight in Vietnam for the French, the soldiers. So I guess if you volunteered for the French Foreign Legion, they would extract you and get you in a better camp, and apparently that's in this book. And you're fed food, and then you start playing football and exercising until you ship out in the French Foreign Legion, which apparently is a horrific thing by itself. You're probably not going to live very long being sent into the jungles of Vietnam to fight for the French Foreign Legion. Poor Germans were probably happy to see the war ended. And like I said, according to this book, the German soldiers were jubilantly surrendering, overwhelming the United States and Britain and all the different countries. And they throw down their weapons, and you didn't even have to guard them or anything. They wanted to surrender. They probably weren't happy with the Hitler regime either. But they were deceived, and prior to World War II, the economic situation in Germany was horrific because of World War I, the Versailles hearings and trials. They put such a financial burden on Germany after World War I that it really caused a lot of suffering. So when Hitler did come along, the people were primed for a leader. Just like when George Bush Jr. Did his thing with 9/11. Even me, a Republican back then, I voted for Obama. I had had too much. I mean, it was just insane. If you're not with us, you're against us, and all these horrific things that happened to all those people in the Middle East. But then I found out President Obama, he was supporting the effort to destroy the Middle East, which apparently is the same thing that President Donald Trump is. And it's not surprising when we know who controls our country. And it's been announced in a major newspaper recently that the political action committees, which are the Jewish PACs, are pretty much in control. What they do is they're limited to how much they can give a candidate. And apparently there's 57 of these PACs. So if you're limited to $10,000 or something. But they have a head PAC who directs all the other 57 PACs. So to swing a $500,000 or $1 million or $2 million, whatever it takes to win that election, it's all under their control and apparently legal, because one PAC can give $10,000. But if you control all the PACs, you can take 20 or 30 or 40 of them to donate $10,000 each, whatever it takes. And of course, they only support people who promise to do what they tell them to do, vote the way they're told. So apparently, and it's becoming more and more clear to people, that these elites, whether they're involved in the banking and the Zionist groups of people, the Jewish religious authorities, the Sanhedrin, which apparently are calling for a new body to control the planet Earth, and they're saying nasty things about the United Nations. So behind the scenes, the politics are real, and we see the death going on all over the world right now. But back to the book. So the French deliberately starved some of these prisoners in order to force them to volunteer to serve in the French Foreign Legion. I like to show you this so you know I'm not making it up. Many of the legionnaires who fought in Vietnam were Germans handed over by the Americans to the French in 1945 to 46. I'm fairly confident that that's not per the Geneva Convention, what they can do to prisoners of war. But again, these people who control our world, on the face of it, they want to say they're doing the right thing. But the truth is, they're behind a lot of the sinister, malevolent atrocities taking place all over the planet, and apparently controlling the weather, according to Dane Wigington, Deborah Travers, and many other people, and my own personal observations, with the dumping of chemicals in the sky and the installation of microwave transmitters and the HARP transmitters. I talked about this stuff again and again and again. Back to the book, page 114. All through 1945 and much of 1946, Pradervard struggled in the ever-changing net of American bureaucracy, trying to help the prisoners of the French. His approach was ingenious. He reminded the generals and diplomats of their principles. And continuing on here, if I find the page, because they have a lot of pictures. Their principles: justice, decency, generosity, pointed out the obligations that these entailed, then offered to help fill them, always with a sense of urgent need of the prisoners themselves. Afraid to denounce the principles, ignorant of the reality that they were supposed to administer, the diplomats squirmed away, inventing new difficulties. So a lot of people wanted to avoid any responsibility for this, and they would lie. Here's some pictures that are in this book about these prison camps. 3 days after the end of war in Europe, prisoners dug earth holes for shelter at Delaine in the U.S. zone. So here's one of the pictures. So they dig in shelters, you can see here, the guy's in the shelter. Can you imagine if it's raining? People were dying in them quite regularly. After the war, and here in America, we were probably celebrating winning World War II. Meanwhile, the people who are our leaders were having the German men, women, children, old men, soldiers, slowly put to death by starvation. Apparently the same thing they did in Russia, up to 100 million people, the Ukraine, and apparently the attack on Venezuela right now. And of course the ships heading to Iran right now, apparently they're planning to attack Iran. And I'm not the only one saying this. A lot of people are saying it. A lot of those pundits and smarter people than me are saying it. I'm just listening and observing and thinking and knowing what they did to these countries that lost wars before. The insane suffering of people, knowing about the Great Depression in America between World War I and World War II, and the depression that was caused all over the world, and the killing in the Ukraine back then. These people in charge of our planet are obviously seriously evil. So here's some pictures. Camps like this one at Zinzag on the Rhine, May 12th, the death rate observed by the U.S. Army was 30% a year. So if you had 300,000 prisoners, 100,000 would die per year. And if they were in the prison camps for 5 years, well, it would only take 3 years to kill them all. And apparently that's what they did. And lineups for scarce water in camps beside the Rhine sometimes lasted all night. So here you're in these camps with no buildings, no beds, only trenches. And you'd stand up all night just trying to get in line for a little water. After it rained, death greatly increased due to the lack of shelter. Along the Rhine, the spring of 1945 was abnormally wet and cold. Five years they ran these camps. And again, I'm reminding people, it was in the news. The U.S. government was saying that we need to have supplies on hand and preparations for the electric grid to go down. President Donald Trump is sending a whole fleet off the coast of Iran right now, including bombers. A couple days ago, they just raised the tariff rate on goods coming from China to 25%. Those things cause wars. Can you imagine making 1 billion Chinese people suffer economically? And of course, we've all heard all these arrogant things President Donald Trump has been saying and doing. It's actually quite bizarre. So, and of course, it's not any help from the Democratic side, like Pelosi and all those other people. It's like there's a bunch of insane people in control of our government, our world. And apparently, with Albert Pike predicting 3 world wars and who and what they would be fought between, he was correct the first 2 times, so I suspect he's going to be correct the 3rd time. And all of this activity, especially with the anti-Christian component of it, and the transgender reality being forced on everybody, it's also fulfilling a biblical prophecy, falling right in line. So any thinking, betting man would say we're probably going to have World War III, some kind of worldwide collapse. And another thing that's in the news lately is they're saying there's this huge asteroid that's going to be passing by Earth. And they named it Apophis. So I went on Yahoo Images, scratching my head, saying, Apophis? That doesn't sound good. It's a giant serpent. And I keep talking about Satanism and serpents and demons. So what are we to believe? Are we supposed to believe something is going to happen? The crazy weather all over the Midwest, the crazy weather going on in Iran. Accusations of they can control the weather. Are they destroying the environment? More pictures. This is the perimeter fence. You can see all the soldiers. The Army provided little or no cooking facilities. Searchlights picked out one young prisoner climbing the wire at night. Of course, he was shot. Other prisoners shouted, "Murderers! Murderers!" So the camp commander cut off their food for 3 days, resulting in many more deaths. Many prisoners die lying in their earth holes. So they dug their own graves. Weakened prisoners often fell off the slippery, narrow mud paths. This one guy wrote on a piece of cloth and tied it around a rock, threw it over the fence. Denied mail, a prisoner in a U.S. camp at Rheinberg threw a note wrapped around a rock over the perimeter fence. The note begs the reader to bring salt and cooked potatoes, because we are terribly hungry. Signed, Jacob Lohr. The note on brown wrapping paper is preserved in the town archives of Rheinberg. It is not known if Lohr had survived. Lohr. So let me read on a little bit, and then I'm going to play a little clip that I made looking up a couple words on Yahoo Images. And that would be the Morgenthau plan to slaughter a lot of these prisoners. And when I looked up the keyword "Germany must perish," which was published before World War II, the elite Jewish people were calling on killing all of the German citizens completely before World War II. So apparently the Jewish elite connected man Morgenthau, and with the Eisenhower and other leaders, apparently they followed through on that. They wanted to kill as many Germans as they could. And even Hitler was probably part of the elite behind World War II. Obviously, he was involved in the Vril Society and Thule Society and these different occult groups, which all these other people in the secret societies are part of. So we, the people in the United States and in Germany and in Britain, the citizens, we're all played for fools. All these people in these secret societies are running things, and they cause a lot of human suffering to get the people to go along, or shock and awe type activity like 911, so all we citizens will shut up and support these evil Arabs who we were told did 911. And then, of course, in the middle of the night, or they scurry to get all that steel out of there and not allow anybody to take pictures or evidence. So there's a lot of obvious evidence that these elites, whoever they are, were behind that event, World War I, World War II, probably the Kennedy assassination, the attack on Syria going on right now, the attack on Venezuela, all that stuff in the news. Again, I say, we the people need to wake up. Prompted by Pravard, this one gentleman who was trying to get the word out about this atrocity going on, the dying and killing of all these German prisoners over a 5-year period. International Committee President Max Huber wrote to the new Secretary of State James Barnes in January to note with gratification Barnes claimed that the U.S. government policy towards prisoners of war is complete conformity with the spirit of the Geneva Convention, and that transfer is allowed by the United States authorities only when there is sufficient assurance that the terms of the convention are adequately observed by the other powers. So apparently the leaders, of course, in the media, then they control the media, they were denying all of this was happening. So take a look at this clip, and you can go on Yahoo image site and look up these keywords and other things and educate yourself. But it's just too horrific, and it's happened more times than we can count in more countries all over the world. Whoever brings us these revolutions, like even in France in 1805 or whatever year they had the French Revolution, they had what they called the purge. All the people that were resistors or intellects, they always do that when they have the revolutions. And they're calling on a world revolution or an American revolution now between the transgenders and the Christians, etc. And the Democrats and the Republicans. And more divide and conquer. The blacks and whites, the men and the women. I could go on and on and on. We all see it. And we citizens fall for it time and time again, the divide and conquer technique, the Hegelian dialectic. But take a look at this video. Hello and welcome to another Yahoo image site word search. Yahoo Images, you can look it up, and you can put any kind of words in there, and you'll see the pictures that are collected. Probably some kind of spider that searches the internet for any associated terms. In this case, I have Morgenthau Plan of Mass Starvation. I'm reading the book Other Losses by James Bacque. The American and French armies caused about 1 million German prisoners of war to die starting on April 1945. So they had about 2 million prisoners after World War II. And apparently part of the Morgenthau Plan was to have these prisoners die. I guess you could call it murder after the war. So I looked up the word, and here are some of the pictures. And I do know in other countries, like Sudan, there have been many mass starvation events. And it seems to me, I'm starting to pick up on some clues, but it seems to me a lot of this could have been avoided, and a lot of this appears to have been intentional. And the families with this one says, new film exposes Russia's mass murder of the Ukrainians. So what a lot of people don't know, that's interesting to me, is that between World War I and World War II, when America had the Great Depression, there were economic collapses all over the world. Did you know that? The Jew who defeated Hitler, Henry Morgenthau, Jr., FDR, and how he won the war. The Jewish Wars, Take Back America from the Jewish People. That's somebody's website, the Jewish Wars blog spot. So they did control our politicians at the beginning of World War I. Woodrow Wilson. The previous president wouldn't go along, so they said, we'll put our own man in place. This is assault on Yemen's largest port. And if you look at the towns and cities all over the Middle East, you're going to see a lot of this. This was not fighting terrorists. These cities, infrastructure, industrial buildings, water plants, sewer facilities. They were all destroyed. Here's another picture here. It says the Jew Kaganovich led the forced starvation in Ukraine in 1932. And for a brief history lesson, remember after World War I, a bunch of organized revolutionary men, I wouldn't call it a revolution in Russia, but an espionage event. After World War I, they went into Russia, the Bolshevik Jewish people, and took over the country, abducted the Tsar and his family, assassinated everybody, and apparently had the assistance of foreign troops to guard the railway stations and everything else, and proceeded, they say, to have killed up to 100 million, maybe more, maybe less, Christians and other Russians after World War I and before World War II. So not only was the world experiencing a Great Depression in the United States and economic depressions all over the world, millions upon millions of Russians were being killed, and apparently, according to this information, as I continue to learn, in the Ukraine they were doing the same thing. Some kind of revenge for years of difficulties with those countries that the Jewish people had. So if you go on Yahoo image site and just put in there Morgenthau plan of mass starvation, you'll find pictures like this. Here's another one. Did you know the founder of Zionism encouraged anti-Semitism as a way to manipulate us? It is essential that the sufferings of Jews become worse. So this is the leader or the founder of Zionism, and he is saying it is essential that the suffering of Jews become worse. This will assist in realization of our plan. I have an excellent idea. I shall induce anti-Semites to liquidate Jewish wealth. The anti-Semites will assist us thereby in that they will strengthen the persecution and oppression of Jews. The anti-Semites shall be our best friends. Theodor Herzl, founder of Zionism, 1897, well before World War I and World War II. All right. So they really caused a lot of starvation in the Ukraine and after World War I to the almost 2 million prisoners, Germans, who were put in big fields with no barracks, no buildings. Gruesome pictures at this. You can click the link. This is in India. A lot of newspaper articles. Poland reduces Auschwitz death toll estimate to 1 million. So they were claiming before World War II that 6 million Jews were in danger. And then after World War II, they said the Germans had gassed to death 6 million Jews. The politics of recognizing the Armenian genocide. So as you can see, it's all over the world where they're depopulating these attacked countries by starvation. This is 1915. That would have been during World War I. Have you received my deportation of and excesses against peaceful Armenians is increasing from harrowing reports of eyewitnesses? It appears that a campaign of race extermination is in progress under the pretext of reprisal against rebellion. And we've seen what's been going on with the Middle East since 9/11, and anybody who tries to stand up for their rights, of course, is called an insurgent or a terrorist. And the people are being depopulated from the Middle East into Europe and America and the rest of the world. So this is all planned and intentional. Continuing with this letter about Armenia, protests as well as threats are unveiling and probably incite the Ottoman government to more drastic measures, as they are determined to disclaim responsibility for their absolute disregard of capitulations, and I believe nothing short of actual force, which obviously the United States are not in a position to exert, would adequately meet the situation. Suggest you inform belligerent nations and mission boards of this. The American ambassador, Constantinople. So the reason, apparently, for World War I and World War II was to destroy the Ottoman Empire, which was operating out of Turkey. And they had a religious leader called a Sultan, just like you would have a czar in Russia or a president in the United States or a prime minister in Britain. They had a Sultan, and they couldn't get the property of the Palestine people, the Zionists, because the Ottoman Empire wouldn't allow that. So with World War I and World War II, the Ottoman Empire's control of the Middle East was destroyed. It's probably one of the reasons why they had World War I and World War II, from my research. You got the leaders here. Looks like Churchill and Stalin and Rothschild Zionist allies. So you can see where Germany is here in this picture, between Poland and Russia. Genocide by famine in the Ukraine. And again, in Russia, between World War I and World War II, on Jeff Rentz's site, there was one report that said up to 100 million Christians and other Russians, not Jewish people, were starved to death or killed other ways. And the Christian churches were destroyed, but not the Jewish temples. The Armenian Genocide Education, Australia. $6 million perish in Soviet famine. So these famines they have are intentional after they have a revolution. It's concerning to me because if we do have World War III, a lot of people are saying that the United States will lose the war. And if we do lose the war, I would suggest that it'll be intentional. And the atrocities we've seen all over the world could very likely happen here and other countries all over the world. And if you don't believe that, you say, Rick, you're crazy. Go look up the Georgia Guidestones in Georgia, USA. And they put it in writing that they want to have a world population of 500 million. So I guess with 6 billion people on the planet, 5.5 billion people need to die. How are they going to do that? Here you got Russian or German Holocaust. So prior to World War II, in the Jewish magazines and pamphlets and newspapers, they were saying that the 6 million Jews were in danger. And here's one of their little news documents. And apparently there weren't 6 million Jews in all of Europe. There were 1.3 in Russia. Not even a million in, well, I guess when you take Austria, 600,000. So a little over a million in Austria, Prussia, and Germany. Great Britain had 51,000. Here's a document from 1912. This is prior to World War I. Think about this, what it says. The American Jewish Yearbook. Remember, during World War II, they said that the Germans gassed 6 million Jews. So this is before World War I, 1912. And in this American Jewish Yearbook, it says, Russia has since 1890 adopted a deliberate plan to expel or exterminate 6 million of its people. So this is before World War I. They were talking about exterminate 6 million people, Jewish people. And also, prior to World War II, if you look up Germany Must Perish, I made a couple videos on this book. But prior to World War II, some Jewish elite people were publishing this book, that Germany Must Perish, the Jewish American plan to exterminate the German people, prior to World War II. Here you go. 6 million people under threat. Germany must perish. And remember, they said Russia was threatening 6 million Jews prior to World War I. And here they're saying Germany is threatening 6 million Jews prior to World War II. So much to learn. Germany must perish prior to World War II. So where are we today? What kind of beings are behind all of this? Appeal to fear, scare tactics. Here we go. Appeal to fear, scare tactics. I've never seen this before. I'm finding it as I'm sharing this Yahoo image search with you. But appeals to fear seeks to build support by instilling fear in the general population. For example, Joseph Goebbels exploited Theodor Kaufmann's Germany Must Perish to claim that the Allies sought the extermination of the German people. So a lot of the things that's in the news, they're using it to mind control we people, to make us believe certain things like 9/11 and some Arabs in caves did it. So they were starving all these people in the Ukraine and after World War II in Germany. And apparently right now Venezuela is under severe threat of population reduction by starvation. And it's kind of crazy because Venezuela is one of the countries with a huge reserve of oil and other minerals, even gold. But apparently the elites who control our planet do not control Venezuela. So they put an embargo on it and financial restraints where they can't sell things like oil. And the people are literally starving in Venezuela. It's interesting when you look at these pictures, the things you find. Starvation. Depressions. Who is controlling our planet? And again, it's concerning to me. And even revolutions. Who controls all of this? Certainly not we citizens. Remains of 3,000 of Napoleon's soldiers found in mass, I guess, grave. So who are these elites? The Armenian genocide. And you could talk about the Russian genocide. And then after World War II, the Germans genocide. And here are the Georgia Guidestones, where it does say that they want 500 million people on the planet to control the population. So whoever these world controllers are, here's a camp, concentration camp, after World War II. Looks like the site's not available. So they talk about the 6 million Jewish people, but they don't talk about the extermination of all the Jewish people, German people, after World War II. And even women and children and old men were rounded up and not fed. Looks like a picture with the Jewish people here. So what is the truth? Apparently in Europe, if you question the Jewish Holocaust, you can be sent to prison. And they're trying to do that here in the U.S., but they don't talk about all the people who were killed, even up to 100 million in Russia by the Bolshevik Jewish people. Call them the revolutionaries if you want to. But it was an act of revenge because they couldn't control the Russian government and the Tsar and get what they wanted. I.G. Farben War Crimes Trial, Obsession of Morgenthau. So again, after World War II, they wanted to exterminate all the captured German soldiers. So much information available. Simply going looking for it, knowing the keywords on the Yahoo image site. Turkey run, Turkey hide. Turkey's guilty of genocide. So apparently the people who control our planet found a simple solution to the problem of people who will not go along with the global world order they're planning to exterminate them. Lots of pictures. And like I said, prior to World War II, there was an attack on Germany. All for this reason, so it seems. Interesting is there are maps of a greater Israel. So prior to World War II, this book was written and sent around the world. Israel must perish. That's not what it's about. It was Germany must perish. So somebody's stealing that line on this picture, but you can see on the right-hand side, they have maps from half of Iraq down to Egypt for a greater Israel. See what I'm saying? Here it's Germany must perish. And then they've stolen that line with Israel must perish. So it's all knowing or understanding what's going on, the mass deception. And of course the movies are deceiving us and misleading us, even with the program Hogan's Heroes after World War II. When here's the truth in this press release, newspaper, the Daily Express, prior to World War II, Judea declares war on Germany. Jews of all the world unite in action. Boycott of German goods. And also right now they're trying to make it illegal for U.S. citizens to promote boycotting Israel goods in 2019. But back prior to World War II, the Jews on the front page of newspapers, as you can see here, declared war on Germany prior to World War II. And it was the elite bankster Jewish folks who did control the president of the United States prior to World War I and World War II. And pretty much it's admitted that the Jewish political action committees, the PACs, control most of our politicians today. And, to be on the alert, President Donald Trump apparently recently this week, May, sent an armada, aircraft carrier, and a lot of other ships to intimidate or put the fear in Iran, and some bomber planes to the Iranian area. So if I was a betting man, I would suggest that they do plan on having World War III. And that's what the point of this little video is. If they have World War III, and let's say the United States loses the war, with all these other wars that they've had, this is what happens to the losers. And you say, well, the United States can't win. Then you better be watching some videos, because I think if the United States loses World War III, it will be planned and intentional. And we know they want to reduce the population. They tell us that. With the Georgia Guidestones, I showed you a picture here a minute ago. But when you find it, you can't find it. But you can look them up and find them. So there's the story. They brought us World War I and World War II because they had plans for destroying the Ottoman Empire in Turkey, which controlled the Middle East, and with Theodore Herzl coming up with the plan for the creation of a Zionist state, Israel. Here's a site here that says how the U.S. killed hundreds of thousands. So apparently this is the kind of camps they had for the surrendered German troops. The dark secret of America's World War II German death camps. Like I said before when I started this, I am reading the book Other Losses, which is about the million-plus German surrendered troops that were literally put in these big 9-mile by 5-mile area with barbed wire fences. If you tried to cross the fence, they would shoot you. and they would deliver very little water or food into these areas. And sometimes the French would back up a water truck and open the valve and just spill all the water onto the dirt, with the prisoners watching and screaming. According to this book I'm reading, the Germans were willing to surrender, and they had too many of them, so they had a thing called the Morgenthau Plan, which was to let them starve to death in these areas. It's a pretty horrific situation, so it seems. This is in Greece. This would be Ukraine. So these are the examples. And of course, how many people died? Millions and millions in the communist Chinese revolution, if you want to call it a revolution. And apparently during World War II, France was engaged in war over in Vietnam, and a lot of those prisoners who had surrendered World War II were offered to join the French Foreign Legion and go fight for France in Vietnam during World War II. That was something interesting to learn. And then, of course, we all know that after World War II, in the late 50s or early 60s, America was engaged in war in Vietnam. But I was surprised to find out that the French were involved in the war in Vietnam during World War II. And a lot of the surrendered German soldiers were offered a choice to join the French Foreign Legion, which of course probably meant certain death. So much death and destruction. Will we have pictures like this for the major cities in the USA? Will the USA lose the war and then they just want to get rid of the citizens like they've done before in so many countries? The Ukraine, the Orient. What is in our future? Should we know about the past? Should we think about the past? Because people who are aware of the truth in the past probably are in a better position to avoid what seems to be looming in our future. So you can see there's plenty of evidence that they were calling for the destruction of Germany prior to World War II. And apparently part of that entailed Mr. Morgenthau, who was involved after World War II and came up with the Morgenthau Plan with Eisenhower and others, and proceeded to do what they have done in many other countries in the last 100, 200 years. And I'm just saying, if they're going to have World War III, or do something like with the warnings that they've given us that we need to be prepared and have supplies in case the grid goes down for 6 months, and all this other gloom and doom and sustainability, global warming, climate change, etc., terrorism. They have something planned. They're pretty busy all over the planet right now. Crazy weather all over the Midwest, kind of insane weather. And apparently in Iran. And so what are they doing? They're sending an aircraft carrier and battleships and bombers to Iran, and a lot of suffering in Venezuela, and I'm sure a lot of other places around the world. So back to this book, Other Losses, about what they did to the prisoners and other citizens after World War II. Prévard devised an ingenious plan in which he outlined in a letter to Edward Kuppinger of special projects at the State Department. He began, as usual, by giving the Americans what might be called the benefit of the doubt, saying, "As you no doubt are aware, the situation of the German prisoners of war now in French custody has become very critical. The International Committee of the Red Cross, through Prévard, was attempting to help the prisoners, partly by using money given to him by the prisoners themselves, and to buy food. This was probably the hardest earned money in the history of the world. According to one prisoner, he had to save for 6 months to be able to buy a tube of toothpaste." And again, I don't mean to be repeating myself, but think about it with that warning that came out of the State Department in the United States recently, that we should be prepared if the electric grid goes down. And all this other crazy things going on all over the world. If you watch Deborah Tavares or Dane Wigington or Richie from Boston or many others, are we supposed to just ignore all of these warning signs? Prévard's problem was currency restrictions. Could Kuppinger help find a way around these? Prévard suggested a way, promising as well not to treat any consideration granted this time as a precedent for another appeal. Kuppinger routed this to Barnes, who then wrote to the new Secretary of War, Robert Patterson, suggesting that it would be appropriate this time for the American military authorities at Paris to enter into discussions with the French military authorities in order to ameliorate, if necessary, the conditions of these prisoners of war already transferred, and so on. Other discussions followed as the prisoners died, until June 13, 1946, when Kuppinger, with a prodigious squirm, denied Prévard on the grounds that the American authorities are not in a position to turn over the items desired by the Committee against payment for French francs. So they wouldn't allow even the prisoners to give money to be able to get something to eat because they didn't want any currency exchange. So they wanted the prisoners to die. Then however, it is believed that the committee's desires in this connection have been substantially met by the inclusion in Section 9 of a clause which might or might not permit the prisoners to buy, in competition with the civilian black market, food which had already been allotted to them. So apparently a lot of the rations, even from the Red Cross, that were supposed to go to the prisoners wound up on the black market, and of course a lot of evil people were making money on it. And the prisoners were dying. The little French or American food that was doled out to the camps was depleted by theft on its way to the prisoners. It then appeared on the black market. Raoul Lepertieri, mayor of Bascons, southeast of Bordeaux, who had given work to 2 German prisoners of war in his chain of haberdashery stores, wrote a stinging letter to the General de Gaulle about the situations at the Lodes, southeast of Bordeaux, I'm saying these French names wrong, where there were many prison camps. Heedless of the reprisal that was likely to come, and did, Lepertieri wrote, "The French army amazes and disappoints the farmers, who see that the requisitions levied on them don't relieve the painful situation in the cities. The explanation for this is the fact that the military administration, which takes for its so-called needs a larger part of the requisitions, greatly exaggerates the amount of supplies required, and it seems from all the evidence that all of the army's surplus ends up in the black market. Oh my! So you take the farmers in France or wherever, and you requisition, take 50% of their crops, for example. And what can they say? Nothing. For the army's needs, and supposedly for the prisoners' needs, but it winds up in the black market. So the people in charge in the army were selling this for money on the black market. What kind of evil is out there? And I'm saying again, you know, if they shut down the commerce economy in the United States, what will it be like? You take a city like Miami or even Savannah, Georgia, any of these big cities. They shut off the food supply. The semi-tractor trailers don't deliver anymore. The gas pumps are empty. Would the powers that be do this? Is that a fair question? What does the evidence lead us to believe? Have they done this before? Will they do it again? What's prophesized? What's written about their plans in the books I've gone over? I guess that's a lot of rhetorical questions, and probably preaching to the choir. The people who watch my videos are usually alert to all this. Page 116. In May 1946, the State Department was still gingerly considering the possibility of opening mail service to the prisoners in U.S. and French camps. Acting Secretary of State Dean Achton wrote to Henry A. Wallace, Secretary of Commerce, that there is a considerable demand among people in the United States for the opening of a channel whereby they might send parcels of food and clothing. How was it that the August Achton had discovered this considerable demand among people in the United States while firmly seated behind his desk in Washington? He had found out from Prodavard, who had detected and perhaps even generated this heretofore unknown demand. Further, Achton was able to tell Secretary of State Barnes the French would be glad to cooperate in satisfying the Americans. He enclosed a copy of a letter from Marshal June to Prodavard, saying there was no objection to this proposal. And that was how, more than a year after the war ended, the prisoners finally started getting some mail. The joy of these men who had been waiting for news for months was beyond description, one Quaker observer said. The French made little use of their starvelings. In France, in January 1946, just over 500,000 men were nominally at work for the armies or the civilian economy. Most of these underfed, barely clothed, weak, and worked at far less than normal efficiency. Another 124,000 were so sick they couldn't walk. With 600 dying men fell off a train, when 600 dying men fell off a train at Bugloos near Bordeaux in the summer of 1945, before the shocked population of the village, 87 men were in such bad shape that the 2-kilometer hike to the camp killed them. So the men couldn't even hike 2 miles, 2 kilometers. In camp, the rest of the men, in their indecent rags, stared through the cracked and dirty windows into the wet pine woods perhaps thinking of the pretty story of the French guards had told them back in Rennes. You're going south to pick grapes. It was easy to imagine themselves in the sunny vines popping ripe grapes into their mouths. As the grapes ripened and no one came for them, they realized that their only purpose was here to die. So they really weren't putting these prisoners that France had requisitioned, they really hadn't put them to work. Even when they're right next to a vineyard and the guard says, you're going to work soon, the prisoners had fantasies about working, picking grapes and popping a ripe grape in their mouth. But none of them were set to work there. So they were in those prison things, according to what I've been reading here, in these prison camps. They were in there to die. Just like in Russia, Ukraine, and many other countries. And all in the Middle East since 9/11. If you look at go on Yahoo image site and look up bombed buildings, you'll see that they're literally bombing the cities and destroying all the buildings. And when you think about Venezuela and their dire situation today, a country with vast oil reserves and minerals, there's no reason for the starvation. And what if they do attack Iran and Russia backs them up and we go into World War III? Don't you think the whole system will shut down? And what I've been reading here will be repeated here in America? So many of the people died. In Librerdine, a work camp, nearly 25% of the men died in January of starvation, dysentery, or disease. The dysentery was so bad that the French came down with it. The work at Librerdine was called forestry, but it was a ghastly charade of the conventional picture of burly woodsmen chopping down trees. So some of the captured German troops were supposed to be working as woodsmen chopping down trees. Many of the guards were ashamed of the condition of the prisoners, whom they had to lead into the woods to work. Most of the prisoners had little or no experience, so they were already at risk. Starved with bad boots or none, ignorant of the process, they were often injured. Once injured, such men died quickly. There were many who died on those work teams. And if anybody thinks me making this video, reading this book and this material, if you think I get any enjoyment out of it, think again. I don't like doing it, but it's more important to me that people know what's going on all over the world, what has gone on, and what is likely to happen in the future. If we don't wake up and come to our senses and realize in these political action committees, these PACs, are controlling our politicians, and it's the citizens who will be the enemy. Just like in 2015, they had that Jade Helm exercise. Troops and equipment, even artificial intelligence software being used. They're testing this stuff. Door to door, demanding people to surrender their weapons or whatever. Like the Boston bombing and the craziness with Sandy Hook. 9/11 and so many more. These guards, mostly decent men recruited from the villages and farms around, did not think about vengeance, although many of them had recently been prisoners themselves in Germany. So the French citizens around these prison camps did not hate the prisoners. Actually, they felt sorry for them, and some of them snuck in some food or milk to them. They did not torture or maltreat the men, but left them alone as much as they could. Some of the guards brought a little food from their homes to feed the famished Germans. 2 of the Germans said that they would have died without the liter of milk brought to them every day by a guard who lived on a farm nearby. Heinz T had bad Krogenich. Heinz T had left a bad Krovenich. I guess his first name is Bad. In May, thinking his trainload of sick, starving comrades was a strange gift for the Americans to give the French. He was still wearing the same shorts he had on when he was captured in hospital. He was barefoot. He was cheerful. He was 18 years old. Apparently he wrote a letter. I'll read this letter and end this video. I went with people who had just been operated on in the hospital, but that didn't matter. They loaded us all up. We crossed the Rhine by the Roosevelt Memorial Bridge, which was temporary. I remember being in open wagons looking straight down at the water, which was frightening, as the bridge wasn't very solid. That was on the 8th of May, and there were a lot of American aviators around who were celebrating their victory. I only had one piece of ID showing my birth date as 1927. I thought they might release me if they thought I was only 16, so I changed the 7 to a 9, but it made no difference. That didn't stop them. I was taken to France too. We heard that there were American camps in France where prisoners were well treated. We heard that in Reims, the Germans controlled the traffic. They even scolded the French drivers that made the French angry. We went to Rennes, but it wasn't until 2 months had gone by we were handed over to the French. They put some food on the train with us. The labels said 10. 1, so we thought that meant enough. Food for 10 people for 1 day, and we were about 30 people. I'm having to read his writing. So we thought there would be 1 day on the road. So they had rations for 10, and there were 30 people. So he deduced they were giving them 1 day's supply of food. But we traveled over 3 days without getting out, completely locked in. I was wondering when I was reading this, suppose you have to use the bathroom. I guess you're in a boxcar. You're just going to have to find a little place in the corner. We would look through the little cracks to see where we were. At one point, someone said he saw the Eiffel Tower, but he couldn't see Paris. Then, after 3 days, we arrived in Rennes. There were more than 100 prisoners in the camp, about the same as in the city. In the barracks were beds, the first we had seen in many weeks, 3 levels high, made of wood, with nothing else, no straw or anything. So the beds were made with wood boards. We slept on the boards. This was the first time we were covered by a roof since we were captured. We had spent 3 weeks at Kranovich on the ground, not allowed to make a fire or dig a hole. Our work during the day was to line up for a bit of water. So that was the work for a day, stand in line all day for a bit of water. It was brought by farmers and put in barrels, but it didn't even have enough time to put in the barrels because it was all gone, because sometimes people would make holes in the pipes and get at it first. It's always the same wherever there is hardship. And again, I was reading this and I was thinking, like the warning coming from the government of the United States recently, that we should be prepared in case the electric grid goes down. Terror, cyber attack, EMP. What kind of insanity will happen when people don't have electricity or water or food? We've seen the riots already in some situations, maybe where there's a shooting by a cop of an individual and then the people riot and burn the stores. It's a sad thing to say, but people seem to lose their minds in these stressful situations. There was a real shortage of food. When the peas arrived, they were divided, and once they had been shared out, some were still left. Everyone counted, and if we had 6 each, then we'd wait till we got 6.5. Can you imagine you get a caseload of peas and you only get 6 peas? We stayed at Renee's almost 8 months. In those months, we understood why we had been brought into France. France needed soldiers. They had a big problem in Indochina, in Algeria, and they wanted to staff their foreign legion. We were infiltrated by German agents who worked for the French to round up soldiers. When the Americans left the camp, they did shitty things to the French. The French revenged themselves on us. So the Americans apparently did shitty things to the French. And so the French took it out on the German prisoners. The first thing the Americans did was to take everything out of the military hospital. They broke the windows so they could also take out the heating system. The French watched them do all this. And they also took a whole load of cement and dumped it into the river. The Americans were real bastards. That's what it says here. The prisoners that the French had taken by themselves fared much better. There was another group of prisoners who arrived from Norway. They were taken across Germany by the British, and they thought they were going home, so they carried huge sacks with them. But then they arrived in France. That was in 1946. The war had been over a couple of years now. When they got to our camp, they were well fed, and we asked them if they had been through Germany, and they said yes. But the British didn't care if some got away. They looked the other way, and if some got away, that was too bad. In Norway, they were still armed 4 months after the war. They were confined to an area, but they still had all of their belongings. So I guess in different places it was better or worse. The soldiers who did join the Foreign Legion were put in another camp nearby where we could see them, and in a couple of weeks they were well fed, looking stronger, but we had become weaker and weaker. We could see them starting to play football, singing, and we were right beside them. Can you imagine? People who joined the Foreign Legion in the adjoining fenced-in area camp were being well fed and singing and playing football. I met a university math professor. And he gave me private tutoring in mathematics. This is the 18-year-old guy who's writing this letter. I got a piece of canvas from one of the barracks, and I could write on that. I found out that I could understand everything I wrote, but as soon as I erased it from my memory, so that it was the first sign of fatigue not to remember things. So they were so undernourished, you couldn't even remember something. It was terrible. I erased it, and I was no longer able to remember what I had just written and understood. I was not depressed. It was just malnutrition. My friends in the camp who were older wrote to my parents when they got back to Germany, and they said I was incredibly cheerful and that I had raised their spirits because I was not depressed. I don't know how I did it. I had developed a philosophy of protection when we found ourselves in the camp for the winter. We thought they were going to ship us off to the States. I understood we were in for a long time and everyone has his own defense systems. So I said to myself, okay, we're making a film. It's captivity. I'm an actor. I can get out of here when I want, but I won't be paid, so I'll stay for a while. So he's rationalizing in his mind, 18 years old. As I had done a bit of acting in the youth films in Berlin, I knew a little bit more how it worked, so I said that's what it was. A lot of the French would go by on the road near the railway at Rennes and would stare at us, and we would look at them, and finally I said to myself, it was like a zoo, except we don't know which side the monkeys are on. So finally I viewed the barbed wire not as something to prevent us from leaving, but something to prevent those we didn't want from entering. That's another issue. I get these different thoughts. So he's kind of dealing with this insane situation, making it like some kind of fantasy thing, 18 years old. But I've been saying that attempt, well, the craziness in the news about putting that fence up between America and Mexico, I'm saying if we do have World War III and things get crazy in America, a lot of Americans are going to want to flee south to Mexico. They don't want that. They have to put up the fence to keep us Americans from getting out, not the Americans from getting in. Just saying, it's my thoughts. Tell me where I'm wrong. Back to this guy's letter. There were little crutches when it goes on like that you have to grab onto something. But later, when the weakness really came and the slightest movement made you faint, we could calculate how many hours we would pass out. So apparently they were so malnutrition that if you stood up quickly, you would just fall over faint. And apparently you wouldn't wake up for 2 or 3 hours. So they could tell the time by jumping up, and when they woke up, they know how much time had passed. So if they knew the water was coming in 6 hours, they could jump up and pass out, wake up in 3 hours, jump up and pass out, and then wake up again in time for the water. How insane is that? The malnutrition got to such a stage that the smallest gesture done too quickly would cause us to faint. The first time it happened to me, we were sitting down in the sun with nothing to do. Absolutely nothing. I can remember saying to myself, as we sat on the ground in the sun, okay, there are still 6 hours until the soap. Since there is nothing to do, no books or anything, I said, if I do a quick little movement with my arm, I'll be out for 3 hours, just like I said. I did pre-read all this. And if I do it again, I'll be out for another 3 hours, so 6 hours altogether. I'd be out for 6 hours, which didn't get counted on my captivity period. So, my 2 hours are up. But I did make a little clip. One of my commenters asked me, was I aware of an asteroid that's apparently in the news and the government or NASA is saying it's a threat to Earth. And then my friend looked up a video and somebody from NASA was talking to a scientist, and they were talking that we needed to spend millions of dollars and to develop the technologies to either smash a rocket into the asteroid to divert it, or aiming laser beams at it, or a nuclear missile to explode it. And so I went and looked into it, and the news is just bizarre. What the heck is going on? Where do they come up with this stuff? And what does it tell us? This asteroid, what did they name it? And what does that name mean? See this little clip. And thank you for watching this video. Leave a comment below. Give me a thumbs up. Let me know what you think. Rick Marrico reporting. So as a little sidebar, and the types of insanity that is thrown out to the public, one of the commenters on one of my recent videos asked me if I was aware of an asteroid supposedly coming close to Earth. So I went and looked it up, asteroid near Earth. So apparently a lot of other fear and doom and gloom news is being put out there. Is it all deception and propaganda? And what else is it telling us? So a huge asteroid, Apophis, flies by the Earth. So again, one of my commenters said, was I aware of this? So I went and looked it up. And here it says, fly by Earth on Friday the 13th. Near Earth object. And then a friend of mine went and looked it up and found a video from some scientists from NASA saying that the government needs to spend millions and millions of dollars and come up with a plan on how to either destroy or deflect it. But what got me crazy here was the name of this thing, Apophis. Here you got Asteroid Watch, Jet Propulsion Laboratory. Asteroid Apophis close flyby with Earth in 2029. So just to show you the level of insanity that we're dealing with, is I went on Yahoo image site. They named the asteroid Apophis. And I went on Yahoo image site and I looked up Apophis. I kid you not. I kid you not. The god of darkness. I keep saying evil forces. And here you got the asteroid hitting Earth. And it says on the right here, how and when will Apophis asteroid collide with Earth? So if you don't think that they're promoting all this fear and where it's coming from, I don't know what to tell anybody. It's pretty clear to me that this is a lot of this satanic preconditioning, mind control by some kind of evil beings, and they're trying to make it look like legitimate news. A few years ago, here's this one article, an asteroid will come incredibly close to Earth, and it's nicknamed Apophis here. So that's just too crazy to believe.